natural rights.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you, Suzanne Levin and Giulio Tellini, and all the members of the scientific committee for having me today. In their early writings, in the ideologues' early writings, we sometimes find the expression natural rights. This is particularly true of Denouë, one of the main writers of the 1795 Declaration of Rights. In 1789, he wrote a short text entitled Le Contrat social des Français, in which he explained that the only reason for the establishment of societies is the desire to ward off the intrinsic evils of the state of nature. These evils are the infringement of what Denouë called the sacred rights of the individual: life, liberty, property, and possession, which everyone, he said, is entitled to enjoy by virtue of what he calls the dogma of the equality of natural rights. Denouë used the expression natural rights in a transcendental sense, and he did that again in 1793 in his Vue rapide sur l'organisation de la République française. I quote, "All men are free and equal, hence personal property, resistance to oppression, and all the natural rights to go under the name of liberty." Security and property are civil rights that the social pact adds to natural rights. Denouë was not alone. Some historians have identified a place in Volney's work for this question of natural rights, particularly in Les Ruines and La Loi Naturelle. However, these examples should not be misleading. Ideologues are profoundly opposed to the so-called natural rights existing prior to the social state. Following in the footsteps of Helvetius and responding to an utilitarian logic of rights, the ideologues reject, within the Republican model, the very possibility of recognizing so-called natural rights, whose foundation will be in a pre-social state of human. This goes hand in hand with the development of a new epistemology that breaks with any transcendent idea of nature. The human science developed by the ideologue does not, however, break with the idea of nature, since all our knowledge derives from observation and experimentation with the human nature. In this respect, it is possible to identify a form of kind of neo-stoicism in their work, in particular in the work of d'Estudes de Tracy. This implies a redefinition of rights in relation to the Declaration of 1789, which they gradually transform into what they called individual rights. So the development of ideology during the Revolution goes towards a rejection of the naturalness of rights. However, although they did not reject the principle of the Declaration of Rights in 1789, which appeared to be a decisive act in the overthrow of the Ancien Régime, the future ideologue gave moderate support to the project that was eventually adopted. The reasons behind this apprehension are similar to those at the heart of ideology. Ideology, as a theory of knowledge based on a scientific study, cannot be but view with apprehension any legal system found on a transcendental idea of nature, even more after the terror. So, the support to the declaration in 1789 was very ambivalent and merely anticipate their own in 1795. Let's take two examples. Gara expressed several reservations that led him to vote against the declaration. His biographer had already identified the first effects of the sensualist philosophy inherited from Condillac, and which was to become that of the ideologue, according to which truth, being subject to facts and to the new sensations that result from them, could not be contained absolutely in the Declaration of Rights. That if the Assembly took this resolution, it would place limit on the power of reason, and that its declaration, instead of being a philosophical and progressive work, would only be a catechism of a new kind. Gara would have feared that the very metaphysical declaration of 1789 would lock in the development of the human spirit and its progress. For this part, in 1789, Destutt de Tracy showed a particular attachment to the draft declaration drawn up by Sieyès, rather than to the one that was finally adopted. Here again, the influence of the philosophy of the spiritual father of the movement was felt. Sieyès' draft states, "There are two ways of presenting great truths to men. The first is to impose them as articles of faith, to burden memory rather than reason. Even so, a declaration of the right of the citizen is not a series of laws, but a series of principles. The second way of offering the truth is not to deprive it of its essential character, reason and evidence. We only really know what we know with our reason." Sieyès continues, human is by nature subject to needs, but by nature he possesses the means to provide for them. In this project, Sieyès placed particular emphasis on the relationships between humans, which are born of the reciprocal utility they each find in them. Finally, Sieyès insists that rights derive from human nature. Two men, he writes, being equally men, have to an equal degree all the rights that derive from human nature. The Abbé's proposal anticipates the conception of rights that Destutt de Tracy adopted when he published his Traité sur la volonté individuelle and his Commentaire sur l'esprit des lois de Montesquieu in the early 19th century. Despite this position, Destutt de Tracy later defended the Declaration of Rights against Burke's attacks. At least, he defended it in its principle. In this letter to Burke, he writes, "If our declaration, it's a kind of mismatch, our conduct is an excellent commentary on it. Nevertheless, in view of his support for Sieyès' project, which was more in line with the philosophy of ideology, rejecting all transcendent and a priori concepts, it is not surprising that his support for the Declaration of 1789 and the principles it formulates is only timid. Ideology does not reason in terms of principle, but in terms of causal deduction based on facts." So, ideology is a theory of knowledge resistant to the recognition of a transcendental natural human right. Starting in the mid-90s, just after the terror, this new philosophy emerged, spearheaded by Destutt de Tracy and Cabanis. This philosophy had to Condillac's sensualism and Helvetius' utilitarism, aimed to base knowledge and the sensible experience of facts. Ideology, as Destutt de Tracy defined it in his Mémoire sur la faculté de penser, is the science of ideas. It is based on two fields of study: rational ideology, developed by Tracy, which takes understanding as its primary object of study, and physiological ideology promoted by Cabanis, which takes a human physical body as its primary object of knowledge. This new epistemology, which placed science and experience at its foundation, aims to break with the old metaphysics, which is merely misleading. The main criticism leveled at the concept of human natural rights as presented in 1789 is that it is tent with what they call metaphysics. For these authors, the question of the naturalness of rights necessarily entails that of the state of nature, human's hypothetical antisocial state. For Cabanis, this state is a pure fiction of the mind. It has never really existed. For the ideologue, human's natural state is the state of society, since human is naturally sociable. This natural sociability is based on sympathy. It is therefore impossible to legally base human natural rights on these antisocial states, which science and experience cannot prove. All a priori knowledge is necessarily refuted, and any right pre-existing the social state cannot, in essence, be known, let alone from the basis of a legal order. Moreover, ideology is a philosophy that renounces the possibility of knowing the first cause. Yet, the question of the origin of society raises the question of the origin of the species. The rejection of first cause removes any possibility of a legal system being based on a fact that cannot be proven. A human natural state, as human natural state is a social state that led the ideologue to move from the question of human natural rights to the question of human rights in society. Such was the thinking of Denis. In 1795, he rejects the principle of the naturalness of a right in favor of the rights in human in society. Denis explicitly rejects recourse to natural rights. In his observation sur la manière de rédiger une déclaration des droits, he writes, I would not like, to entrain any system based on the state of nature. Removing the anchoring of rights in a higher state of nature would make it possible to found a republic of property owner, as defined in particular by Boissy d'Anglas in the third year of the French Republic. It should be noted that Article 1 of the Declaration of 1789, men are born and remain free and equal in rights, disappears. Reduced to these objectives, Denis' republicanism would, according to Yannick Bosque, be no more than a minimalist republicanism defining itself not as a republicanism of principle supporting natural rights, but as an opposition to the monarchical form of the state. Ideology also implied a revolution in scientific method, including in the science of law. As early as 1793, when Denis was considering how to write a declaration, he favored the analytical rather than the synthetic method. The synthetic method proceeds by means of general principles followed by consequences. This method cannot be applied to science that can only be applied to science that have already been complete, which, in the eyes of the ideologue, is not the case for the science of declaration drafting. In his essay sur la Constitution, published the same year as the Vue Rapide, Denis attributes all the ills of the 1789 declaration to the synthetic method used by the 1789 Constitution to draft the declaration. He advocates the method of nature or analysis, the only secret of teaching as well as discoveries. Analysis, he wrote, takes as its basis, or rather as its starting point, pure sensation or particular ideas immediately related to pure sensation. So we can see the influence of sensualism on his law philosophy. This does not mean, however, that the argument of nature is swept aside in the development of the legal system. As Denou demonstrates when discussing the method of analysis, this method is also that of nature. If we turn to Destutt de Tracy rational ideology, we find the key to explaining this reference to nature. The ideology tends towards a form of scientific use naturalism. So, the development of scientific use naturalism serves a project of a republic of scientists. The aim of the ideologue was to place knowledge at the heart of the republic. The importance of knowledge and science in their philosophy led them to develop a form of scientific use naturalism, and this led them to the emergence of individual rights that needed to be guaranteed against infringement from the state. In his commentaire sur l'esprit des lois de Montesquieu, Destutt de Tracy asserts that positive law must conform to natural law, to the human nature. And according to Bertrand Binoche, the aim of this text is to elaborate something like a use naturalism that is finally scientific. Destutt de Tracy is a sort of heir to modern use naturalism, which can be traced back to a historic conception of natural law that includes reason in its definition. And reason tends to replace nature. In this Stoic conception that is taken by the modern school of natural law, whose main representatives are Grotius and Pufendorf, we can see, particularly for Pufendorf, that he considers natural law to be a product of human natural sociability. It is one of the bases of primary rationality that human can, through rational deduction, construct a legal system. The same is true of Tracy's proposed legal system. For the ideologue, human is naturally sociable, and this natural sociability leads them to exchange with other humans. It is through this exchange that human learns about natural law, as they contribute to the development of their reason. To this gradual discovery of reason, we must add the scientific dimension of the philosophical study of man developed by Cabanis. This study makes it possible to base ideology on constant facts. Vonnet, in the same vein, defined natural law as follows. It consists entirely of facts, whose demonstration can be constantly renewed to the sense, and compose a science as precise and as exact as geometry and mathematics. And it is for the very reason that natural law forms an exact science that humans, born ignorant and living distracted, have known it up to our days only superficially. All that remains is to build a science of law that is no longer an a priori science, but one that is deduced from the law of reality. For then on, we must no longer look for law in nature as an a priori given, but consider that law is deduced from nature, and nature it is its efficient cause. In his book, L'idée républicaine en France, Claude Nicollet distinguished between what he calls a transcendental and a deterministic conception of natural rights. The former, inspired by Christianity, is said to have been endorsed by a number of 19th century French liberals. The second, according to Claude Nicollet, it is the definition of natural rights as developed by the ideologue. This definition would give rise to a secular and individualistic theory of human rights based on a science of ideas that would logically link science and politics. Nature is no longer translated as transcendent, but as that which belongs to what is empirically measurable, to the reality that can be said to be the scientific mode of causality. The risk with this conception of nature is that it can no longer serve effectively as a normative foundation for a legal system. So, as Justin Mixangula observes, when he sets out to define use naturalism, the science of natural law constitutes an open door to legal positivism. Why? Because not only have use naturalists secularized law, but they have also revealed the limits of their own logic of thought. They state that law is the fruit of human reason, and therefore the will that derives from his reason is not to suggest, in fact, that law is confused with power. This observation led Claude Nicollet to say that the ideologue secular and individualistic theory of human rights contains serious contradiction, opening the way to positivism. Reason thus takes place of nature, and the result is that law will hold within the body of laws laid down by the human mind. The outcome of this thinking, imbued with a kind of stoicism, is, in spite of appearance, a genuine legal positivism. This tension led members of the movement to abandon the term natural rights for good in favor of individual rights, which it's the state's task to guarantee. When Jean-Baptiste Essay was asked to write a review on Cabanis' some consideration on societies in 1799 for the journal La Décade philosophique, he could only welcome the abandonment of the naturalness of right in favor of individual rights. Cabanis justified his move in his consideration, and he observed that all such government must be funded on the basis of individual rights. These rights cannot be described as natural. The evolution of his vocabulary is thus the result of the emergence of a social science which, as Yanis Bosch observes, has made it possible to reject the doctrine of so-called natural rights in order to found a republic of owners, which is no longer concerned with protecting rights rooted in human's nature, but with guaranteeing the rights of humans in society according to a liberal utilitarian paradigm. In addition to being a republic of owners, the republic of the ideologue is also a republic of scientists. Power should be entrusted to those whose reason is sufficiently educated to perceive and feel the law of nature. The ideologue Republicans' project never saw the light of day. Despite an attempt at realization under the Directoire, the members of the movement quickly became disillusioned with the fact that the Enlightenment had not spread widely enough. This led them to support the emergence of a strong government in the person of Bonaparte to guarantee individual rights and preserve freedom. Naturally, by 1799, Cabanis and others were deluding themselves about Bonaparte's ambitions. Disillusioned with the consular regime, the ideologue quietly withdrew from political life. However, in 1819, Denot published a work entitled Essai sur les garanties individuelles. The aim of this work was to theorize how the state could be limited to protect individual rights. It was also conceived as a reaction to the end of the empire. Defeated by history, the ideologues are little known today. Yet their doctrine has survived through those it influenced. Foremost among them is Auguste Comte. Comte's influence and the Republican of the Third Republic is unquestionable, and the ideology influence did not disappear with it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all for having me today. Cisalpine political experience has often been interpreted as a struggle between instances and powers based more on the ability to improvise than on the rigid reference to constitutional dictates. In fact, pretending to know the Republican experiment of the Triennial, thinking that it faithfully reflects what is written both on the constitutional text and in the speeches and pamphlets of politicians and intellectuals of the time is certainly illusory and limiting. To fully understand the Cisalpine experience, it is necessary to delve into the concrete and daily political dynamics between institutional and non-institutional powers. However, there is a risk that fundamental theoretical elements, such as natural rights, may appear to be mere revolutionary rhetoric, a backdrop to effective political practice, and then considered superfluous. On closer inspection, this stark dualism has never existed, and the discourse on human rights is proof of this. To understand the role played by human rights in Cisalpine politics, it is necessary to start from the institution that first made use of them, namely the political representation. It is also a question of highlighting here an original interpretation elaborated by the representatives of their role, which exploits, in the first place, an interesting link with the theme of rights to the reworking of the theoretical principles developed during the late 18th century. The first obvious feature of the Cisalpine legislative body is a negative quality. It is not elected. Although on several occasions deputies justify not being elected, referring to the maturity of the Cisalpine people, who, ravaged by centuries of slavery, is not yet ready to recognize his own good, all the theorists who spoke or wrote about representative democracy stressed the central role of the act of election in the constitutional geometry of this new political system. As Giuseppe Duso writes, political representation is the mode of expression of the will of the collective subject and at the same time contains the source of its legitimacy, which lies in that expression of the will of all that occurs in the act of election. In the Cisalpine context, therefore, there is a lack of the fiduciary relationship between the elected and the electors, which should guarantee the latter the correct representation of their will as unitary and national. It should be understood that the first problem of Cisalpine representation is a problem of legitimacy. The first concerns of the Great Council are in fact directed towards the search for an alternative way to build this link. It is in this context that the proclamation of the legislative councils to the Cisalpine people, drawn up at the end of November 1787, should be read. On 25 November, during the fourth session of the Grand Council, the deputy Antonio Tadini made a motion for the Great Council to form a commission charged with drafting a proclamation addressed to the Cisalpine people, so that the latter may entrust its representatives with all its confidence. This proposal is opposed by Representative Cavedoni, who believes that proclamations are useless to merit the confidence of the people. We must, he says, deserve it by enlightening him, and by making his happiness through wise laws, and not by empty, fruitless proclamations. End of the quotation. But Tadini supports his motion, alleging that the representatives, he says, not being elected by the people, must ask for his confidence to show him the purity of their intention. So his motion is approved. Before considering the proclamation, it seems right to ask, is the election really the only act by which, manifesting the general will, the people bind themselves to their representatives? To answer the question, we need to understand what is, in the opinion of representatives, the function of their role. To this end, there are many possible quotations to refer to. It is possible, depending on the brevity required for the speech, to synthesize the opinions expressed in different contexts with the following formula. Representation must defend the great interests of the nation. We find these words, for example, in the speech given by the mathematician and representative Gregorio Fontana on his inauguration as president of the Great Council at the beginning of the first session. We must, he says, in this venerable place, discuss and balance the great interests of the nation. The people have entrusted to our hands the sacred deposit of their most cherished interests, their happiness, their fortunes, their existence. The idea that the duty of representation is primarily to guarantee the interest of the nation is also expressed by Giuseppe Compagnoni in his famous essay Elements of Constitutional Law, linking the theme of interest to that of the general will. In the chapter on the representative democracy, Compagnoni explains how the representatives fulfill their function by announcing the general will, deduced through the shared analysis of the interests of the nation. Just following the line drawn by Compagnoni in his essay, it is possible to understand the theoretical operation carried out by representation in the definition of its function. Apparently, in fact, the principle of the representation of interest seems to refer to a logic of the old regime, for which the representatives, bound to an imperative mandate, defend in front of the sovereign the interests of that part of society to which they are respectively linked. But the great interests of which the representatives are the custodians cannot be in a republic those of the particular bodies in which society was divided before the revolution, but must be a unique, general, universal interest to the political body. This, finally, will only be the need of each associate to know guaranteed their inalienable rights. It is in the translation of the interest into right that the function of representation is changed, which is therefore found to be substantially linked not to an imperative mandate, but to the general defense of human rights. This semantic shift is revealed by Fontana himself, in a second speech given the day after the one quoted above. In this speech, Fontana identifies as the primary duty of the representation that of guaranteeing the people the exercise of their inalienable rights, described as those gifts that nature has bestowed upon man and that society must ensure to the citizen. The way through which fulfill this goal is indicated by Fontana in the Constitution, which must be the foundation of every legislative act. In this sense, the Constitution represents the meeting center of all interests, as Melzi de Ril writes in his essay to the Cisalpine people, Speech on the Constitution. We therefore begin to understand how, recognizing in the constitutional text and the Declaration of Rights the materialization in writing of the general will, political representation can guarantee its link with it, even without regard to the act of the election, precisely through the defense of the rights of the man and of the citizen, and what of is generally enshrined in the fundamental law. These are the terms that we find in the proclamation to the Cisalpine people, through which the representatives intend to obtain the trust of the citizenship. In this text, the deputies present themselves to the people, showing the differences between the representation and the despots of the past. While they sacrifice the true interests of the people to ambition and avarice, representatives will aim only at the happiness of the people, through the defense of its rights. The bond between people and the representatives is thus recreated through the insurance of the exercise of rights, and the legislative body will be legitimate even without being elected, as long as it will keep this sacred promise. The link described above between political representation and human rights should not be seen solely as a theoretical solution to the problem of legitimacy experienced by deputies. As mentioned at the beginning of this paper, the Cisalpine political experience was characterized by a continuous struggle between institutional powers, which immediately crossed with ease their constitutional boundaries. The legislative power constantly ran the risk of completely losing its political authority, since the executive power, first in the figure of the General-in-Chief of the Army of Italy and then in that of the Directory and its ministers, always managed to seize a power not his, producing acts of law through proclamations and decrees, ignoring or altering the laws produced by the councils at the time of their execution. It is in this difficult context the deputies immediately understood the political potential represented by their own duty to defend the Constitution and the human rights. It is no coincidence that, in the same days in which the proclamation to the people was drafted and published, the Grand Council undertook to repeal two acts of law, Law 13 and 16 Brumaire, enacted by Bonaparte before the installation of the legislative body. These laws, concerning respectively the abolition of the Ministry of Police and the limitation of the freedom of the press, are declared by the representatives contrary to the Constitution and then repealed. The first real legislative act of the Great Council was, therefore, an act of negative legislation, through which opened a new front in the clash with the executive power, in which the link with the Constitution could have provided representatives an original guarantee of political influence. The idea that in a republic there is a need for a power that watches over the respect of the constitution by the institutions is present in the Italian and Cisalpine intellectual panorama. Even without resorting to the most famous example provided by Mario Pagano, a quick reading of the text produced on the competition of 1796 held by the General Administration of Lombardy will suffice to ascertain the recurrence of this concept. However, such an authority is not contemplated in the French constitutional system of 1795. This lack then benefits the legislative body that, precisely as guardian of the constitution, gives itself an original power of veto, with which to limit the legislative power abused by the executive power. On 26 November, during the fifth session of the Great Council, there are speeches by various representatives, among which stand out for eloquence Vincenzo Dandolo and Giuseppe Fenaroli, and all beat on the same point, that is, that any law which opposes the Constitution is no longer a law, but an arbitrary order, says Fenaroli, that tolerated dishonors equally those who did and those who submit. The oath that they have taken and the zeal that must nurture, who consecrate all of himself to the cause of freedom, oblige them to defend the Constitution and keep it inviolable. It may be interesting at this point to dwell on the laws under discussion and the reasons attached to them by Bonaparte and Minister Giuseppe Luosi at the time of their publication. In fact, especially regarding the 16 Brumaire law on the restriction of press freedom, the words of the general and the minister provide some point of reflection. We will see the spontaneous opposition of two real political theories. Where the representatives interpreted to their advantage the general will as the universality of individual rights to be guaranteed, the authors of the laws present us an inverted view of the relationship between law, general will, and rights. The law signed by Bonaparte, through which the press is placed under the censorship of the executive power in order to prevent, Bonaparte explains, all the ill effects which, through the fault of intemperate writers, could bring to the Republic, is characterized by the constant reference to private disputes, personal hatred, individual conflicts, which in a regime of total freedom risk destroying the harmony of society. According to the general, the greatest danger is represented by private differences, which risk undermining political unity of the nation. This is a thought that often recurs in Bonaparte's communication, particularly in his letters to the Grand Council. The threat of faction and parties, and finally of civil war, accompanies every warning addressed to the newly formed republic. Bonaparte's attention is focused entirely on political unity, which in his speeches tends to coincide exactly with the public good. The result is an inevitable contradiction between the public good and the private interest, which characterizes this rhetoric in its entirety. The proclamation, attached to the law by Minister Luosi, only reinforces this concept, concluding with the following emblematic sentence. Citizens, to whom the vigor of the mind invites you to denounce yourself to the public with the products of ingenuity, first ask your conscience. Do you really feel motivated by the zeal to be united to your nation? End of the quotation. Individual rights, in this case freedom of expression and freedom of the press, are obviously subordinated to a good considered superior, namely political unity, whose primacy is such as to allow the sacrifice of particular interest. In this sense, a law that violates the principle of the Constitution can therefore be published when it safeguards the collective good, even at the expense of individual rights. The reversal of the position taken by the representatives is therefore complete. Although both positions can be motivated by political calculation, that of Bonaparte interested in maintaining order and that of the representatives to obtain a form of political power, their theoretical value must not be overlooked, because it marks an important stage of two ideological paths, both born within the Enlightenment and both destined to deeply mark the history of thought and institutions. Depending on whether the political primacy is assigned to the individual rights or to political unity, two theoretical currents are outlined. The first belongs to proto-liberal thought developed during the 18th century and formalized definitively in the first decades of the 19th century, while the second has its roots in the most radical pages of Rousseau, in which the total alienation of the private in the public is the foundation for the construction of true democracy. It may come as a surprise that Bonaparte's evidently authoritarian stance is aligned with the more radical thinkers. However, at this point, we must recognize the seed of authoritarianism contained in this current of thought, as we must understand the centrality of the discourse on human rights for the so-called moderate current, which in political practice effectively safeguarded the freedom of the citizens. A final example will help to understand what has been said. Let us consider a brief and emblematic quotation from the text with which Giovanni Fantoni, a known patriot, participated in the aforementioned contest of 1796. His definition of freedom is as follows. What is freedom? It is the power that man has to do what does not harm the rights of others. He has nature as principle, justice as rule, and the law as safeguard. His moral boundary is in this maxim. Do not do what you do not want to be done to you. When this evidently does not serve to save the nation. The final note cannot go unnoticed. According to Jacobin Fantoni, the good of the nation precedes individual freedom, exactly as expressed by Bonaparte. According to both, general will does not reside in rights, but in the unity of the political body, which at the time of its formation ceases to appear as the set of individualities, but is reborn as a whole, a public body in which every particularity is expendable. We return instead to consider another passage taken from the aforementioned essay by Compagnoni, Element of Constitutional Law, dedicated to the death penalty. Compagnoni accuses the same Rousseau of overturning at all any idea of social pact when the profound writer says that the life of the citizen is no longer just a good received by nature, but a conditional gift of the political body. To explain himself better, Compagnoni outlines an imaginary scenario in which the nation requires one of its citizens to sacrifice himself, this being the only way for the nation to survive. In this case, Compagnoni says, arbitrariness is substituted for justice, and selfishness interprets by general will what is nothing but violent suggestion of interest. The nation really perishes when the social pact for which only the political body exists remains violated. The definition of freedom by Fantoni is therefore accused of sophistry. Individual freedom is not expendable even if the salvation of the political body is threatened, since this is nothing but a form of guarantee of the rights of the associates, and it would perish when even one of these guarantees is missing. We can associate this thought with the position taken by the representatives, of which Compagnoni was a member among the most influential until the reform by Trouvé. Likewise, we can recognize a paradoxical similarity between the Fantoni's radical thought and Bonaparte's authoritarian thought. In this complex opposition, the role of rights seems fundamental more than historiography has so far highlighted. It is not, in this case, the always cited contrast between unitary and federalist or between Jacobins and pro-French. The clash, which appears central in the deeper dynamics for the development of modern political ideas, concerns the role of rights in the social pact and contrasts a liberal idea that sees the state as a means for individual happiness and an idea which sees the individual as a means for the good of the state. In conclusion, in the Cisalpine experience, the debate on the role of human rights is not only not dormant, but is at the heart of political dynamics. In the struggle between powers, rights play a fundamental role in allowing representatives to retain an original form of political influence. In the theoretical elaboration and the debate between opinions, the placing of human rights in the hierarchy of political principles categorically defines different positions taken by the main protagonists of the time. Thank you.